Hello, this is our presentation of the Progressive Era and specifically women organizing. Our presentation uses a timeline technique to showcase the order of events. Our timeline begins in the late 1800s with Mary Harris Jones. Jones was a prominent activist who focused on establishing child labor laws. Although Jones was not a women's rights activist, she was an activist who was female, which is pretty unheard of for the time. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union was established in 1900 with aim to secure better working conditions for female factory workers. The ILGWU eventually adapted their goals to endorse education for women and develop more female-supporting and less sex-discriminatory communities. Similar to Mary Harris Jones, Pauline Newman was a prominent woman leader as well. Newman fought hard to obtain equal pay between the sexes, and it led the previously mentioned International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Newman supported the Uprising of 20,000. The Uprising of 20,000 was an 11-week strike in New York in which young women and teens held a strike in an attempt to gain shorter work weeks and increased wages. For the first time in history, men and women fought together for union rights in the Paterson Silk Strike of 1913. The Paterson Silk Strike, in which workers of the Paterson, New Jersey silk mill stopped working, strived to gain better working conditions and 8-hour workdays. Although this attempt failed at gaining what it demanded, this was a huge step in gender equality. Jeannette Rankin was an outstanding activist of women's suffrage, being a part of the National Women's Suffrage Association. The NSWA had the goal to acquire voting rights for females, who were obviously U.S. citizens. Rankin was also the first congresswoman, specifically being in the House of Representatives, in 1917. In 1920, women were finally granted the right to vote in U.S. elections, after decades of fighting. Congress had passed laws preventing states from disregarding a United States citizen's right to vote away because of their sex. On the next slide, a video will be played, showing the stepping stones of the ratification of the 19th Amendment and what women had to endure to fight for this right.
Rights movement. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was introduced, which would give black men, but not women of any color, the right to vote. Suffragists were split. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the amendment, objecting to the exclusion of women. They formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, hoping to pass a constitutional amendment that included women. Others, like abolitionists Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, supported the 15th Amendment. They founded the American Women's Suffrage Association and lobbied for the women's right to vote on a state level instead of through a national amendment. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Black men could vote, but women still couldn't. In 1878, a women's suffrage amendment penned by Susan B. Anthony was finally proposed in Congress, but it was defeated on the Senate floor in 1887. In 1890, the separate suffrage movements merged, opting to tackle suffrage by state in the wake of the federal amendment's defeat. Within 6 years, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho granted women the right to vote. Wyoming had already done it in 1869. Around the same time, the National Association of Colored Women was formed, bringing together more than 100 black women's clubs. It included leaders Mary Church Terrell, Josephine Silent Yates, and Anna Julia Cooper. By the turn of the 20th century, the women's suffrage movement had gained renewed momentum. Parades, marches, and pickets drew great attention to the cause. Between 1910 and 1918, a number of states and territories expanded voting rights to women. In 1912, 15,000 suffrage supporters took to the streets of New York City. But as women's political power grew, so did the danger they faced. In 1913, on the eve of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, hundreds of women were injured in a massive suffrage parade in the nation's capital. In November of 1917, 33 suffragists were arrested outside the White House. The women were clubbed, beaten, and tortured by prison guards at the Occoquan workhouse. One of the movement's leaders, Alice Paul, founder of what became the National Woman's Party, was placed in solitary confinement in order to break her will and undermine her credibility. But press coverage of the women's treatment increased sympathy for their plight. And in 1918, Representative Jeannette Rankin, the first woman in Congress, opened congressional debate on a women's suffrage amendment. The resolution failed. In 1918, President Wilson also came out in favor of suffrage, declaring it was needed as a war measure. Wilson argued that women had been providing vital roles during World War I, and that their votes should be counted in order to make the world safe for democracy. Finally, in 1919, the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment, the same one written by Susan B. Anthony back in 1878, was passed by the House and the Senate. And on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially incorporated into the U.S. Constitution, prohibiting denying the vote to a U.S. citizen based on.
That last word should have been gender. You cannot prohibit somebody to vote based on their sex or gender. In 1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act into law, prohibiting sex-based wage discrimination. This meant women cannot be paid less as men for doing the same job just because of their gender. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. Title VII of this act specifically prohibits employment discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin. This graph clearly shows how important this act was, considering where women's employment was when the act was around started and where it has gotten since then. How women employment rates have grown.
The Educational Amendments of 1972 were signed into law by Richard Nixon. Title IX of these amendments prevents discrimination of sex in educational programs that are federally funded. This was a big step for women because now they can get the same education as males without being treated differently. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court passed the Roe v. Wade decision, protecting a woman's right to a medical abortion. This decision gave women anatomical rights to their bodies and empowered the voices of many women that felt silenced. In 2022, 49 years later, the ruling was overturned. Although many women and people see this overturning as a step in the wrong direction, the original passing of the decision in 1973 inspired many women and young females. The effects of the decision were never reversed, showing that women do have a voice. In 1981, Ronald Reagan sworn in Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman to serve as a Supreme Court justice. O'Connor was inspirational to many women, showing that women do have a voice in politics and can work in positions of power alongside males. In 1993, Bill Clinton nominated Janet Reno to be the first woman to become a U.S. Attorney General. Similar to Sandra Day O'Connor, Reno's position was inspirational to many women throughout the United States, showing that women do have a voice and a place in society. In 1994, Bill Clinton signed the Violence Against Women Act into law, which was a huge step for protecting women, specifically women that have endured domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. This law improved punishments for U.S. citizens that have committed the crimes that I listed. In addition, services and help became easier to obtain for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. In 1997, Bill Clinton nominated Madeleine Albright to be the first woman to become U.S. Secretary of State. In 2007, the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives chose Nancy Pelosi in a majority vote to be the first woman to become the Speaker of House. Pelosi then went on to serve 2 terms as Speaker of the House. In 2013, women were granted the right to serve in military combat positions for the first time in U.S. history. Finally being able to serve their country, women could feel equally honored as U.S. citizens. In 2021, Kamala Harris ran with Joe Biden as the first woman in history to become vice president, a huge respected role in government. In 2024, Harris ran for the president of the United States of America but lost the election in a close vote by the people. Even though she lost the election, she showed young girls and women everywhere that their voice can be heard, and they are not any less than their male counterparts. In 1830, women did not have a voice, place in government, the right to vote, equal pay, and they were seen as inferior to males. Women were not hired like men, and gender discrimination was abundant. Although sexism is still relevant today, women now have important roles in society. For example, today, women are allowed to be military officers, soldiers, and government officials. Women are now allowed to seek educational opportunities, whether that is a high school diploma or advanced collegiate degrees.